And it's not just social media. So this is a newspaper report in San Diego, came out at the start of the month, 1st of May, talking about the big plans in San Diego for the construction of some very large potable reuse, purified recycled water plans that have been underway for a couple of years now and are progressing in San Diego. This headline, as you see, says, "Will COVID-19 turn San Diego's water plan into toilet to grave?" And it's a report of an opinion piece, effectively. They didn't even get the name of the journal right, but it was a piece that was published in a scientific journal talking about or really postulating that COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 might present additional challenges which we're not necessarily ready to deal with. So for example, the state of California currently requires 12 log removal across the treatment train, but that might be enough in the face of pandemic onslaughts by newly evolved viruses. Talking about additional log removal credit may be needed to protect public water systems in light of a virus outbreak. So we're seeing these sorts of issues being raised, questions being asked from social media to newspapers to in fact academic journals, editorials as well. So I thought a good way to run through it is to have a look at I guess a generic concept for a purified recycled water scheme. This is an image that was developed in Queensland at the end of the millennium drought a decade ago when they were developing the Western Corridor recycled water scheme. And I used this one because it does give us a fairly generic sense of the different types of barriers that we might be talking about for a purified recycled water scheme. So looking at urban use, what's actually being used in towns and cities, generating wastewater from those towns and cities, going through various treatment barriers. So the first one being the conventional wastewater treatment plants, and then in this example, into a microfiltration barrier, a reverse osmosis barrier, an advanced oxidation barrier, then back out into the natural environment. This scheme involves surface water augmentation into a big reservoir that is used in southeast Queensland to supply drinking water, and then through the conventional drinking water treatment processes before becoming drinking water and being used for that purpose. So I thought I'd use this scheme to sort of go around these various steps, and we can look at them one at a time and consider where we end up at the end of that particular process. So that first barrier, as it's described here, is source control, but it's really about what's going into the wastewater and what do we know about what's going into raw, untreated wastewater. We do know that, and we do expect that there is a source. There's a viable source of SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater. For a start, it's very similar to the original SARS virus, for which infection of the gastrointestinal tract was well established, and there have been many reports of. It's not unexpected. Another reason it's not unexpected is that the types of the cell receptors that the virus hooks into through those spike proteins are expressed in the small intestine. So there's a viable mechanism, a realistic mechanism that provides the opportunity to be thinking about, is this a potential source of this virus in feces and therefore in wastewater? Turns out this particular paper had a couple of different sources of data in it, but from a meta-analysis had been reported that close to 50% of patients patients who have been confirmed to have the disease did show the presence of SARS-CoV-2 RNA detected by PCR in feces. And then the paper itself ran a much smaller study with a much smaller group. They found that around about 15% of patients, they were able to detect the viral RNA present in feces, and they were able to start putting some numbers on how many copies of that genome were present in feces. So median viral loads of 4 to 5 copies per milliliter, depending on whether the patients are exhibiting gastrointestinal symptoms or not. So we expect it to be in feces, or we expect the RNA to be in feces. Does that mean that there are viable virus particles, virions, in the feces? Again, going back to the original SARS, that is something that was established, and there are a number of reports of isolating that virus in cell culture. We're really in the early days for SARS-CoV-2, but there are a couple of studies. They're very small. They usually involve cultivating fecal samples from 1 or 2 or 3 patients, and in most cases they're unsuccessful. It seems to be difficult to find viable viruses or to cultivate them. It's hard to distinguish between the two. But we are starting to see a few studies now that have reported cultivation. So in other words, there are viruses in feces that they can take from the feces, they can infect new cells from that culture, and from that they can use techniques, in this case using an electron microscope, to identify that something that looks very much like this virus is present in these cultured samples. So not a huge amount of information, but some evidence that we are seeing some viable virus particles in feces. So if we think about what might be in wastewater, we still don't have any direct evidence of viable viruses in wastewater, in the raw wastewater. But if we look at some of the reports that have come out looking at RNA, that would give us an extreme upper limit on the number of viable particles that might be present. And we're seeing numbers highly variable across different studies. A study that came out of Queensland, around about 100, just over 100 virus particles per litre, and then larger numbers in some of the other studies have been reported from overseas. That's still pretty early days in that science, and I think we've got a long way to go with really optimising some of those quantitation techniques. But when we look at what we're used to dealing with in sewage for the viruses that we do deal with, things like noroviruses, enteroviruses, adenoviruses, rotaviruses, the orders of magnitude that we might be expected to have to deal with, and that guidelines that have been developed have been based upon, are conservative. If anything, they're on the higher level than the orders of magnitude of simply the RNA that might be present for this particular virus. So we don't seem to be dealing with massive numbers that are going to overwhelm the procedures, the risk assessments, the assumptions that we've put in place previously in water recycling guidelines. Thinking about what happens to this virus in wastewater, one of the first things to think about, in fact, comes out of this study. Patricia Gundy and Chuck Gerber and Ian Pepper's paper looking at coronaviruses a few years ago. It was published in 2009, and they were looking at the survival of these viruses, or how long they remain viable in water and wastewater samples. And one of the things that they observed is for the coronaviruses, it's very difficult to even get the time zero value. As soon as they start dosing coronaviruses into water, into a wastewater sample, they immediately saw 3 log reduction. So their time zero, they were trying to get some kinetics. So over a long period of time zero, they start off with much lower numbers than they'd originally intended to dose in, compared to, for example, poliovirus, where the concentrations or the viable titer only dropped around about 10%. So big change just in presenting it into this particular solution. No evidence for it, but they postulate that this decrease may be due to the presence of solvents and detergents in the wastewater that will compromise the viral envelope and ultimately inactivate the virus. So it's not an attractive medium for that virus to exist in. Then when we do look at studies that have looked at persistence over a period of time, once you have a starting starting concentration, we tend to see, there's a few different papers that we can look at, but we tend to see numbers of the order that are shown here. So this data, this paper, comes from SARS-1, the original SARS virus, showing that it could persist in domestic sewage, hospital wastewater, at around about 20 degrees for about 2 days. So we might have 2 days persistence if the temperature is around 20 degrees. However, if the water is cold, and again, this is a fairly consistently repeated finding, if the water is cold down around 4 degrees, then the persistence is much longer. We're talking a period of weeks in wastewater. Similarly, other studies have shown for envelope viruses, this MHV here is a murine hepatitis virus. It's a hepatitis virus for mice, type of mouse. And it's very similar. In fact, when we look at some of the characteristics, it's a coronavirus, it's a single-stranded RNA virus, it's about the same genome length of genome size as SARS-CoV-2. In unpasteurized wastewater at 25 degrees, the T90 value, so for 1 log reduction, they're looking at about 13 hours. Other envelope viruses or envelope bacteriophage, around about 7 hours. So these are shorter periods of time for that 1 log reduction compared to what we see for the non-enveloped bacteriophages and the types of phages that we use normally to characterize the fate and persistence of pathogenic viruses in wastewater. So what this is telling us is that these envelope viruses, coronaviruses, tend to be on the less persistent end of the scale rather than the more persistent end of the scale relative to other viruses that we would deal with in terms of surrogates for waterborne disease. So that's what might be happening in the raw wastewater. If we get to a wastewater treatment plant, you'll see I'll come back to this a few times. There are 2 different guideline documents that I've referred to. One of them is the potable reuse guidelines that have been developed by the World Health Organization to provide guidance for how to safely implement potable reuse schemes and indications of what can be achieved in terms of treatment, both by challenge testing data that's been acquired by challenge testing in laboratories, dosing in viruses, or as well as what the World Health Organization guidelines will accept as a validated removal. So LRV here stands for the log reduction values. This is effectively saying that in a conventional secondary wastewater treatment plant, we can do a study where we're monitoring virus surrogates and see that we're achieving 2.5 log reduction. However, in terms of how much credit would normally be given as a validated performance, that would be limited to 0.5 log reduction because we can't monitor. There's no ongoing monitoring to confirm that this 2.5 log reduction value is being achieved. So these guidelines accept that for a well-operated and designed plants, as long as we can verify that the plant is being properly operated, then 0.5 log reduction values are easily credited to such a scheme, and it can be increased if there is some system specific testing. If you can validate a higher number, then a higher number would apply. The Australian guidelines for water recycling are currently undergoing revision, so they do exist, but this is a draft update for 2020. So I've used the numbers out of that draft update since they're the most current. And as you can see, they're effectively the same or more or less the same as the values that we're seeing in the WHO guidelines. So normally we would rely on these validated numbers here. So as a very conservative approach, we would assume that we could say that we're seeing 0.5 log reduction values for viruses through a conventional wastewater treatment plant, and there's nothing that we know about this particular virus that tells us that it should be any more resilient than the viruses that we're used to dealing with. If anything, it should be less resilient, and therefore we would expect a higher degree of removal. If we go through the next treatment barrier, we can look at microfiltration. Microfiltration, there are 2 key mechanisms of removal. The first one being the size of the virus particle, the size of any particle. It's effectively a filtration process. And if we look at the SARS-CoV-2 virus, this is it here through an electron microscope. It's about the same size as the original SARS virus responsible for SARS, which is about 120 nanometers diameter. And that's actually a big virus in terms of waterborne disease. The others that we're used to dealing with include things like adenovirus at 90 nanometers, rotavirus at 80 nanometers, down here, hepatitis A virus, poliovirus at 30 nanometers. So we're dealing with one here that's on the upper end of the size scale. When we talk about microfiltration and ultrafiltration membranes, there's a lot of variability. But generally, we're talking on the order of ultrafiltration refers to a pore size of around about 10 nanometers, microfiltration around about 100 nanometers. So when we think of that and we think about the sizes that we just referred to, we would say, well, 10 nanometers is smaller than all of those virus particles that we just looked at in terms of diameter. So we'd expect them all to be well removed by ultrafiltration. Microfiltration, 100 nanometers, is actually larger than most of them. The MS2 bacteriophage, hepatitis A, rotavirus, adenovirus. The reason that we do get removal of those viruses is because it's not all about size exclusion. It's also got to do with the charges. So at ambient pH, at normal pHs, a microfiltration membrane has a negative charge on the surface, and depending on the isoelectric point for a particular virus, we would also expect to have a net negative charge on those viruses. So we can see this down here with the isoelectric points. These are all, these two here are below 7, so that means that at pH less than 7, we would expect to have a significant negative charge on the MS2 bacteriophage, and that explains why we get good rejection through a microfiltration membrane that at first glance might appear to be too porous to reject that sort of virus. Same with hepatitis A virus. Rotavirus, not so interesting to think about whether rotaviruses are as well rejected as some of these others. SARS-CoV-2, we're already dealing with a virus that's larger than the others, so it's already up here at 120 nanometers. We expect to have good rejection anyway. At the moment, I don't think we know the isoelectric point. I haven't been able to identify anything that's been published. That will be a useful piece of information when it comes out to give us an extra degree of confidence that the surrogate assumptions that we're making in terms of rejection of some of these other smaller viruses can be easily extrapolated to SARS-CoV-2. But just by size exclusion, we expect it to perform better than the others. When we look at the World Health Organization guidelines and the draft Australian guidelines, we see that the challenge testing that's been done in laboratories does confirm that we can expect to see about 4 to 6 log reductions across a microfiltration membrane. However, for viruses, the WHO guidelines don't give any validated removal because removal is variable and it depends on the particular characteristics of the different viruses. So if it's a small virus or has a high isoelectric point, it may not be as well removed as some of the others. So the guidelines actually say that for microfiltration, the LRVs for viruses can be validated on a case-to-case basis. So we're stuck here with a 0 if we want to take the validated number from those guidelines, and the Australian guidelines for water recycling have adopted more or less the same numbers. So at this point, we're not giving any credit to microfiltration for removal of SARS-CoV-2, and that's a very conservative assumption. If we look at reverse osmosis, high pressure membrane filtration process, there are various ways that have been reported and validated for monitoring the removal of viruses across reverse osmosis membranes. And this is a great review that came out of the University of Queensland a couple of years ago. The techniques that are used, we can look directly at MS2 bacteriophage. And when people do that, they observe through a challenge test up to 7 log removal, so significant removal of a very small virus through that process. But that's not a process, direct monitoring of bacteriophage is not a process that anybody's seriously considering using for online continuous monitoring of reverse osmosis performance. So we tend to end up with some of these other alternatives. We can dose in rhodamine dye. If you dose in rhodamine dye, it's possible that you might be able to observe 3 to 4 log reduction values of that particular dye across the membrane as a surrogate measure for virus removal. More likely, most treatment plants would be stuck with things like conductivity, which we can do online very simply and inexpensively, but conductivity will usually only give you about 1 log reduction. We're looking at the removal of small salts, sodium chloride, etc., across that membrane, and the combination of the sensitivity of the instrument and the actual performance of rejection is only going to show you less than 2 log reduction. Sometimes total organic carbon can be used, which might give you a little bit more sensitivity. In some cases, some plants might use sulfite, looking at sulfate measurement, but that's an offline measurement, but it could potentially give up to 3 log reduction. So that's where these numbers come from when we look at the World Health Organization guidelines. They say, yes, challenge testing. We know that you can get 6 log reduction. We just saw 7 quoted on the previous slide. For validated removal, we're talking about conductivity. We're talking about total organic carbon. So for validated removal, we're really only talking about 1.5 to 2 log reduction. So it doesn't reflect the actual performance, the actual understood performance. It expects what we can reliably and continuously monitor as being achieved. That's for online monitoring of conductivity or TOC. We can get a higher validated rejection if we're prepared to do some offline monitoring of sulfate or dosing in fluorescent dyes and looking at the removal of those fluorescent dyes. But this is the range that we would be working in. If we want to be super conservative, we can assume that we're down here looking at conductivity and seeing about 1.5 log reduction. The Australian guidelines pretty much copy that over directly and say almost exactly the same thing. Then if we go into advanced oxidation, the advanced oxidation schemes or processes that are used for the existing potable reuse schemes around the world tend to be almost exclusively UV-based advanced oxidation schemes, ultraviolet advanced oxidation schemes. We know that ultraviolet disinfection is very effective for viruses. That's obviously not a virus, but the point here is that there's what we call a biocidal or a germicidal wavelength range down here in the UVC range between about 200 and 280 nanometers. And within that range, what we have is the genetic material, the DNA or the RNA of viruses and bacteria and protozoa is chemically changed as a consequence of exposure to UV radiation. So some of these base pairs in DNA are what we call pyrimidines, the 6-membered rings, thymine, cytosine, and uracil. And those base pairs, the way that they pair up is important for a DNA molecule. If we denature that DNA by exposure to ultraviolet disinfection at this wavelength, we can get what's called dimerization. We get bonding between adjacent pyrimidine bases, and that completely distorts and denatures the nucleic acid and therefore disinfects the virus. It stops the virus from being able to reproduce and being able to produce essential proteins that are needed for its activity. SARS-CoV-2 is not a DNA virus, it's a single-stranded RNA virus, but RNA also has these pyrimidine bases, uracil and cytosine, that are present, and therefore we can get that same dimerization process and we can get disinfection. This is a really great paper that came out of Krista Wigginton's group at the University of Michigan, showing that if you shine ultraviolet radiation on various types of viruses, they were looking at an enveloped surrogate here. It's a bacteriophage, Phi6. What you see is in this study, they actually looked at in a molecular way at what's going on at the DNA. They looked at chemical changes to proteins, and they looked at chemical changes to the lipids in the envelope as well. And they could look at the rate of change given a certain amount of UV exposure. And what's illustrated here is that you get denaturing of the genome. You get changes of the genome, of the RNA. As the RNA changes, you get infectivity loss. There's also a little bit of activity going on up here at the protein, so therefore the infectivity loss is slightly greater than the genome rate of change at the genome, but nearly all of the action is about what happens down here at the genome. So what they found was that it's to do with the genome. It doesn't really matter what you change in other parts of the virus. The genome is the weakest link, and so that's where inactivation by UV photolysis all happens. Another paper out of Krista Wigginton's group, they took a number of different bacteriophages with different types of genetic material, so single-stranded RNA, double-stranded RNA, single-stranded DNA, and double-stranded DNA, and they exposed them to UV radiation in two different ways. One is the naked nucleic acid, so just the molecule, just the DNA or RNA molecules, and exposed them and looked for changes, denaturization of the molecule, but then they did the same thing as the whole native virus particle. So a couple of interesting, important things came out of this work. One was that they were able to show that it makes no difference whether you have just the naked strand of double-stranded DNA or if you have the whole T3 bacteriophage, and the same for all of the other examples here. So the nucleocapsid, the proteins that encase the RNA or DNA, don't provide any protection, and the lipid membrane doesn't provide any protection. It's all about at the RNA or the DNA, and the other parts of the virus are irrelevant. They also observed that if that's the case, then the distinguishing characteristics of each of the viruses is really about the changes, the differences in their DNA and RNA. Some of them are double-stranded, some of them are single-stranded, some of them are DNA, some of them are RNA. With a fairly limited data set, they came up with these general observations that if they looked at the rate constants, which ones degraded more quickly, the single-stranded DNA viruses degraded more quickly than the single-stranded RNA and double-stranded DNA viruses, which were then more quickly degraded than the double-stranded RNA viruses. The one we're interested in is right here. It's a single-stranded RNA virus. So we can draw some conclusions that if we know something about disinfection or inactivation of these viruses, we would expect SARS-CoV-2 to be roughly the same as other single-stranded RNA viruses, such as hepatitis A virus, norovirus, Coxsackie viruses, etc., and more susceptible than the double-stranded RNA viruses, such as rotaviruses that we already deal with. So again, this tells us that when we look at validation for disinfection, which is done, which is usually undertaken for the more persistent, the more resistant viruses, there is nothing about SARS-CoV-2 that tells us that it could be a worst case scenario. In almost all circumstances, it's a better case scenario for susceptibility to treatment. So validation for UV disinfection, going back to the US EPA ultraviolet disinfection guidance manual, they provide evidence that if you can provide a validated dose of around 186 millijoules per centimeter squared, that is validated to achieve 4 log removal. So at a normal disinfection dose, 4 log removal is realistic. But when we look at when we look at advanced oxidation processes normally applied for potable reuse schemes, we're using much, much higher doses than a normal disinfection dose. So I've written here more than 500 millijoules, often 1,000 millijoules per square centimeter is not unrealistic. And most water recycling guidelines and standards accept that. So the Californian Title 22 guidelines give credit for 6 log reduction for advanced oxidation, UV-based advanced oxidation processes, which is the most any engineered treatment process gets credit for. And the same for the World Health Organization guideline, they give credit for 6 log reduction as being both challenge tested and a validated guideline. So what they're effectively doing is they're saying, well, that 186 from the guidance manual, which is validated to 4 log reduction, can confidently be extrapolated up to 6 log reduction if you can achieve 235 millijoules per square centimetre. The Australian guidelines again make similar assumptions. However, the maximum validated removal here is more conservatively applied at 4 log reduction. So we can start to pick out these numbers of 6 log reduction for UV disinfection or 4 log reduction for UV disinfection, depending on which particular document we're following. And if we use an advanced oxidation process, we don't get any more credit for that, because usually there are limits to how much log reduction values a regulator would apply to a particular treatment process. So even though we might be talking at 10 times the dose of normal disinfection dose here, it's still 6 log reduction or 4 to 6 log reduction for the Australian water recycling guidelines. Going back out into the natural environment, again, a little bit similar to the wastewater data that we saw previously. If we're talking about warm water at 25 degrees Celsius, there's evidence to indicate that we might get 2 log reduction, 99% inactivation after about 22 or 17 days for other surrogate coronaviruses in water. However, if it's cold, if it's 4 degrees, they tend to be much more persistent than if it's warmer water. So we could conservatively assume no removal, apart from perhaps dilution, in an environment like that. That finding, that observation is consistently found across a number of different studies. These are enveloped or coronaviruses down here. This is a non-enveloped virus. This is poliovirus up here. At 23 degrees, we start to see a few log reduction after, certainly by a week's time. We're seeing multiple log reduction of coronaviruses, whereas at 4 degrees, we're not seeing any significant reduction after a couple of weeks. Finally, after going back out into an engineered, or sorry, a natural buffer, in most of the examples that we would look at, the water would then be retreated at a conventional drinking water treatment plant. So we would have a water treatment barrier where it might involve filtration. The only barrier that we really look at for viruses is chlorine disinfection. Again, coming from Krista Wigginton's group, similar work that we saw previously for ultraviolet disinfection. They actually look at chemical changes at the lipids, on the genomes, the RNA, and on the protein. And what you can spot here is when you expose viruses to free chlorine, there will be some reactivity going on the RNA, but most of the reactivity, by the driving force, is what's happening to some of the proteins, and particularly the proteins around the nucleocapsid. So the proteins that are coating the RNA are very susceptible to oxidation by chlorine, or chemical change by chlorine, which causes the disinfection and hence the infectivity to more or less follow the rate of degradation of that particular protein. What this study showed, again, is that the envelope doesn't help. Having a lipid envelope around this virus doesn't make doesn't protect the virus at all from free chlorine. And in fact, they showed that when you expose some of the envelope viruses that they looked at, the Phi6 bacteriophage, it actually degraded, the proteins on the nucleocapsid degraded more quickly than those on MS2 coliaphage. So a non-enveloped virus surrogate. So again, that having that envelope provides no protection to the virus, and we do expect to see good removal or good inactivation of SARS-CoV-2 and other enveloped viruses as a consequence of exposure to chlorine. If we look at what guidelines, what we know about chlorine, the way that we apply chlorine in terms of applying CTs, concentrations and exposure time products, most of the data that we use, and if you go back to US EPA guidance manuals, it's usually based on hepatitis A virus. And if you look back at the studies, the reason hepatitis A virus was chosen was because it was tougher to kill, tougher to inactivate than other viruses like poliovirus and rotaviruses. So knowing what we know, that the envelopes provide no additional protection, and that the toughest virus that have been identified from the non-enveloped viruses are the ones that the CTs are based on, we expect that we can apply those to SARS-CoV-2 as well. And if we look at CTs that might be applied to target Giardia, for example, Giardia is a much more difficult microorganism to inactivate with free chlorine than viruses are. If any water treatment plant that's targeting a few log removal, 3 log removal of Giardia, will be using CTs of around 50 to 300 milligram minutes per litre, whereas you can get 4 log reduction values of hepatitis A virus for less than 12 milligrams minutes per litre. So we would expect that we can easily achieve those same sorts of LRVs for SARS-CoV-2. And again, if you go back and you look at the data that is available from the original SARS virus, studies are out there which show that it's more susceptible to chlorine-based disinfectants compared to bacteriophage. In this particular bacteriophage, F2, which is more resistant than poliovirus and other colophages. And it's more resistant than E. coli, which is fortunate because it's the one that water treatment plants routinely monitor, the bacteria. So we don't expect this to be any tougher than the organisms that we're looking at. If anything, it's on the much easier to disinfect side of the equation. So when we look at the validated log reduction values for chlorine through potable reuse guidelines, we tend to be looking at 6 log reduction. The Australian document says 4 log reduction at a particular CT greater than 15 milligram minutes per litre, which are realistic operational CTs. So when we add all these up and we think about a multi-barrier system, with the 2 guideline documents that we looked at, the World Health Organization and the Australian guidelines for water recycling, we can take very conservative assumptions at every step of that process. No wastewater die-off, it's all live virus in there, which is outrageous, an outrageous assumption. Secondary treatment, only half a log reduction. No removal for microfiltration, which is equally an outrageously conservative assumption. Even if we say 1.5 log removal based on conductivity monitoring for reverse osmosis performance, 6 log reduction for advanced oxidation process, nothing happening out in the environment, and then 6 log reduction for chlorine, then for the World Health Organization guidelines, we're already talking about more than 14 validated log reductions across that process. If we were more conservative, which we saw was more conservative at most steps, and took the Australian guidelines, then we might just say more than 10 log reductions across that process. Realistically thinking, when you think about all those conservative assumptions that we've made, realistically, if we can get the data, when that data is available, it will be possible to show that more than 20 log reduction is more realistic across a system like that. What does it mean if we try and put it in the context of where we set risk in the WHO guidelines and the Australian guidelines? We talk about DALYS, disability adjusted life years, and they're a measure of the burden of disease. So I won't dwell too long on these next couple of slides, but just wanted to say that there are a couple of studies out there, and I used this one, which was published in Science recently, estimating the burden of disease for this particular virus in France. They look at, for the patients that are infected, what's the probability of the infected patient being hospitalized at different ages? Of those that are hospitalized, what's the probability of ending up in intensive care? And of those that are hospitalized, what's the probability of death? And we can use those numbers to go through and come up with some estimated disability adjusted life years for 4 different groups: the not hospitalized, the hospitalized, those in intensive care, and those who actually die. And we can talk through these numbers another time, but a key point here is when you actually look at these numbers, the final answer, the final number, if you're trying to put a number of DALYs per infection, is all dependent on the deaths. And it's all about deaths of people aged 60 and older that completely drive this equation. So if you sensitivity test a lot of the assumptions up here and up here, they don't make any difference. The answer comes from the significant numbers of people who die aged 60 and over, and therefore the years of life lost as a consequence of those deaths. And so it's these numbers here which drive this total answer down here of 0.084 DALYs per infection. And if you add all of them together, we end up with 0.087, almost the same number, DALYs per infection. That's a big number for DALYs, much greater than crypto or norovirus, which are around about 0.004. So this is telling us it is a pretty horrendous disease. It is a disease that has a high burden of disease, high burden of illness. And that's something that I guess we already recognize, but when I sort of ran through a few of those numbers, it really brought it home to me. So if we went through and we do what we do for the drinking water guidelines to decide how much treatment do we need, we would say that the health target, if we're targeting around about 1 microdally, 10 to the minus 6 DALYs per person per year, I'll cut it short because I see that we're a little bit short of time. But if we go through and make really conservative assumptions at every stage of the process, 100% public susceptibility, there's no immunity in the community. The dose response is 1. If you're exposed to it, you catch it, which is, again, an outrageously conservative assumption. If we go through that process and we apply the most conservative LRVs from the Australian guidelines rather than the WHO guidelines, this gives us a number that we can start to think about. An acceptable raw wastewater quality would be 2.5, 10 to the 2.5 virus particles per litre. And we can see that that's already more than what we're seeing just in RNA concentrations. These are RNA concentrations, not live viruses, but they're, even if all of that RNA represented a live virus, we're below the benchmark risk number here that we would be for the 10 to the minus 6 DALYs per person per year that we would normally work with. If we use the World Health Organization data, this would be 14 log reduction values across that treatment process. And so this would be 6.5 here. Therefore, all of these other studies that we've seen from the US and France that have reported higher numbers of RNA in sewage, even if all that was cultivatable, viable virus, we would be demonstrating that we have treatment processes in place that are sufficient to remove all of it down to acceptable levels of risk. Thank you very much. There was a lot of information, a lot of rushing through there. I apologize, but I'd be grateful to answer any questions.
That's great, Stuart. You might be able to pull the question box up on the screen, but I'll read them out for you anyway. So this one from Fernando, is it possible that wastewater workers specifically have a higher risk or vulnerability to the virus during the early stages of, I'm assuming, wastewater treatment?
Yeah, so that is what has been proposed in a couple of the studies that have been published, that's where the risks may lie. So as we saw, we have less of an evidence base available to say that there is no infectious virus present in wastewater. However, we also don't have a strong or really any evidence base to say that there is. So I think we saw that if we look at what's in fecal material, there's a lot of RNA in fecal material. Whether or not there's a lot of cultivatable, viable virus in fecal material is something that's emerging. We're starting to see that there is some, but at the moment we don't have direct evidence of any of that surviving in wastewater, and we have some evidence to show us that survival in wastewater is not great, although we could be talking a period of days. So if we're talking about exposure to raw wastewater, I'd say that's where the jury is still most out. There might be realistic risks from exposure to wastewater, but still not a lot to be able to substantiate the suggestion that there is at this point.
Okay, thanks for that, Stuart. I'm sure there's more work to be done in that area. This question from Jim Fear at SEQ Water. How can we tell a simple story that recycled water is safe to drink rather than referring to the LVRs, etc., that pretty much mean nothing to everyone?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, obviously we do need to put it into plain language, but I think the plain language is that everything we know about this virus tells us that the way that we manage waterborne disease, viruses that cause waterborne disease, this virus, A, presents no additional challenges, and B, if anything, it's on the easier side to deal with for practically every treatment process. We looked at chlorine, ultraviolet disinfection, membranes. It's a larger virus. It's more susceptible to chlorine. It's likely more susceptible to UV. Everything we know about how we treat water through conventional and advanced water treatment processes tells us that this virus does not present an exceptional challenge.
It's interesting when you think that through, that but everything else, it's one of the most I suppose infective and impactful viruses we've had this century. Well, this century and most of last century as well. So it'll be interesting to see how we're messaging. Ashley here has made a comment that she's trying to put an infographic together on how the potable recycled processes address COVID-19, which pictorially, you know, I think picture tells 1,000 words and could be useful.
Yep.
Jeff Hamilton's asked, is it common knowledge among water professionals that indirect unplanned potable reuse is already happening throughout Australia and worldwide, and how will this be monitored and managed in terms of COVID-19 transmission? Is it really a problem considering the other beasties in the water?
Well, that first question might be one for you, Paul. Is it common knowledge amongst water professionals?
I think it's common knowledge amongst water professionals. I don't know if it's common knowledge or general public turn a blind eye to it. But there, you'd have to say that there is quite a high proportion of unplanned potable reuse already happening throughout Australia. Yeah, so it's interesting how people turn a blind eye to that. They'll probably tend to overlook the fact that there may be COVID-19 transmission paths and pathways within that. They'll just assume that loss of identity or even just ignoring it means it's safe.
Yep. And I think Jeff's question there goes to the point, which is that there are other beasties present in the wastewater. Most of those other beasties are tougher to deal with than this one, and they're the ones that our water treatment processes have been designed to target. So if we're dealing with those effectively, we've got every reason to believe that we're dealing with this one effectively.
Yeah. This question from Paul Sherman, is chloramine effective in most recycled water schemes other than purified water schemes? Free chlorine reacts with ammonia in the water to form chloramine.
To answer that question, I would go back to the original CT guidance for viruses, and what we know is that chloramine directly as a primary disinfectant is much less effective than free chlorine. But there are numbers that are available. We can look at what sorts of CTs would be required from chloramines to achieve a particular level of disinfectant. Those numbers are going to be much higher, but I think we can consider what they are. I'm sorry, I can't tell you offhand what the numbers are. In fact, I think mostly for chloramine primary disinfection, you wouldn't give credit, I don't think, a significant amount of credit for virus disinfection. I'd have to check on that, but I think most plants would be using chlorine at the plant, some form of chlorine disinfection at the plant, and then chloramines for maintaining a residual in the distribution system, where that's a much more or much less likely place for this particular virus to be introduced in the first place.
Yeah. Fernando's got a follow-up question. Do you suggest any changes for water recycling processes in response to SARS-CoV-2?
No, I don't. I think that's my take-home message from this presentation and from looking at all of this data. Of course, there are other water recycling process trains, and we need to go through the same sort of thought process on other process trains. But looking at the thought process applied here, I think that the clear conclusion should be that what we are already doing is more than enough to deal with the risk of waterborne transmission of this particular virus through a properly designed, engineered water recycling scheme. So no, I don't think that there are engineering implications at all.
Good point. Ashley would like to know if you've got any common language you use to explain how virus might still be detectable but not active in water, the so-called degradation.
Well, I don't know if it's common language, but I look back at studies that have been published over the last few years. I saw one of a horse that died, I think it was close to 5 million years ago, and had been buried in the snow somewhere. And scientists were able to come along and recover the DNA of this horse and identify many of its characteristics through that millions of year old horse. Doing so does not imply that that horse is still a live, viable organism. And I think that that's what we need to communicate. That's what we need to explain, that there can be fragments of DNA lying around long after you or I are dead, or a 5 million year old horse is dead. And the same thing applies in this case. Detecting RNA, detecting genetic material, does not imply detection of a live organism.
Yep. I just love that analogy about a dead horse, flogging a dead horse, so to speak. The next one I've got from Paul Sherman about messaging. Does the diagram for multiple barrier system look like a, my question page keeps scrolling up. Does it look like a SARS-CoV-2, or has he been looking at too many diagrams?
It does, doesn't it? It's a lipid membrane with a few spikes coming out of it. Paul's right.
Palenque, you've noticed that you've been referring to the recycled water draft guidelines and being in the process of rewrite. When can they be expected to be finalised? So
it's just been out for public submission, public consultation, or industry consultation, in fact. I think, Palenque, the key person to contact is David Cunliffe at SA Water. My understanding is that that industry consultation period is just about drawn to an end, if it hasn't already. But David's likely to be accepting comments right up until the very last moment possible. That's his usual modus operandi. But once I think it's finished, I think there'll probably be a small number of modifications that will need to be considered as a consequence of that consultation, and hopefully it will be wrapped up well and truly before the end of this year.
Yeah. So I suppose this next one, and Jim Fear asks this straight up front. The comments re the Sunday Mail recycled water article and COVID. You got any more to say about that one?
Well, I think it's what we're talking about, that people will extrapolate the studies of wastewater-based epidemiology to meaning that the virus is present in an infectious form in wastewater. And I think that the water industries are the only people that are going to get out there and counter that misassumption. So that's what we need to do.
Our good friend Ian Law has asked the question, given that the number of purified recycled water plants do not use dual membrane systems, but ozone, GAC and UV AOP, would your conclusion re LVRs or LRVs still be the same?
No, we would have to go through the same processes and look at the LRVs. We know that processes like ozone can be very effective for virus inactivation. But I think that the same thought process needs to be applied for different types of treatment trains. And at some point, it would be good if we start getting a bit more real data that better reflects SARS-CoV-2, so that we don't have to make these outrageously conservative assumptions at every step of the process.
One from Nanda. Do you think there's a responsibility of researchers and utilities that when tracing SARS-CoV-19 through wastewater, that we're only looking at RNA, not a virus? I'm not quite sure what that one means.
I think she means a responsibility to make it clear when it's being reported in the media that point should be made. Absolutely, there is a responsibility. I suspect that media releases and other comments to the media have made that point, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to come across, and particularly not in a headline. But absolutely, it needs to be hammered home each time.
Yeah, it'd be useful if someone could find a real analogy about, say, someone's presence was detected because they left a mobile phone trace, rather than that they are actually there per se. I don't know, some sort of simple analogy. Jennifer, Mackay, yes, it is a challenge to communicate this. I think that's a comment more than an answer in relation to this. Johan van Dam, so the good news is that the SARS-CoV-2 is not going to cause an issue with good practice in water recycling, but given hundreds of other potential virillae could jump to humans, does the question of increasing LRVs during pandemics merit further discussion and investigation?
Well, maybe. I think the issue here is whether or not you have a virus that does have a longer lifespan in water, is more persistent in the face of disinfection processes such as chlorine and ultraviolet disinfection. If we found that there was some new virus that came along that showed all of the conservative worst case surrogates that we've used to come up with the current LRVs were no longer conservative, then yeah, of course, we would need to recalibrate what's a reasonable assumption. But that virus will have a lot of competition. You know, there are a lot of viruses in water and wastewater that we pick the more conservative surrogates for, including bacteriophages. So I think it's unlikely that one will come along that will prove to be tougher on all of those fronts. But if it did, then yes, of course.
Yeah, sure. Got a great comment in here from Murray, just highlighting that was a COVID-19 toolbox talk. Is very informative about the risks to wastewater staff, and that COVID-19 is no different to other pathogens present in wastewater. So it's just a notice by him that there is some collateral out there that utilities can use that's available through WASA.
Yeah, and the other thing that's worth mentioning is, at the moment, at least, a complete lack of any epidemiological signal for any waterborne disease exposure. And I think that is significant given how much attention we're paying to this particular virus around the world at the moment. If there was an elevated risk to wastewater treatment plant workers, I suspect we might have started to see a few suspicious cases by now.
Yeah. Here's a curly one from Jennifer. Legal issues here with foreseeability and hence negligence of operators.
Indeed, but then again, these are the same issues. I think these issues always apply. They apply to other pathogens in water and in wastewater. It's not obvious to me how this particular virus presents additional legal implications for those types of scenarios or practices.
I think we're coming towards the end of our time. But I'll ask a couple more. Are you happy to continue on for a little bit, Stuart?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, that's all right. And for any of the administration, let me know if we're running out of time or we're up against a particular deadline, because this is a very engaging conversation we're having here. Paul Sherman, in sewage chlorine is added but will react with the ammonia in sewage. He's referring to recycled water schemes other than purified, irrigation type schemes, purified water. So, how's that? So I suppose his question is, how's that impacting? Does it have a lesser effect?
Yeah, so he's saying that so we do need to rely on the inactivation from chloramine, from monochloramine, rather than a primary disinfectant of free chlorine. I think that's the case, and I think that it means that we need to go back and we need to look at what sorts of log reductions can we anticipate conservatively for viruses from chloramines. If I'd anticipated Paul's question, I'd have looked it up and had the answer for you, but I don't have it, I'm afraid.
What do you consider will trigger acceptance of direct potable reuse in Australia? Should we give up now or wait until we see our water staff regional centres surrender to the water supply lifeline that DPR will deliver? Thank you for that one, Jeff.
Is that another one for you, Paul?
I think we've got to be optimistic. I don't think this presents us with any more challenges than that we've got around getting our communities across the line on direct potable reuse. In many respects, going through this is helping educate the community around these. Hitherto, no one's really cared about viruses. I think in Sydney, the last time was around, they weren't viruses, it was around the protozoans, the Giardia and Cryptosporidium. And so it helps rather than, I think, detracts from the case for a community to have to confront these sorts of issues, because it gives scientists and medical practitioners an ability to put some real facts in front of both politicians and the community. So I'm optimistic that the time will come.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's just see what we've got else down here. Lots and lots of comments about thanks for a great presentation, Stuart. And I think we might leave it there. And I'd like to echo my thoughts there and thank you with a virtual round of applause for what has been an excellent presentation. So big thumbs up on a great and very informative session. Before I close out, and Stuart, if you wouldn't mind switching on to the next slide, if that's possible. I just wanted to advise of some upcoming events. We've got starting next week, Oswater Online. That's going over 4 weeks on a Tuesday and a Thursday, including some virtual drinks and networking. And it's a great opportunity for you to stay engaged with the current information that's going around. In August this year, we're planning to have the New South Wales State Conference. And again, we're hopeful that we'll be able to get together and run an excellent event just as we did last year. The Newcastle Subcommittee branch, very active, got an online seminar with the Young Ward Professionals presentation in June. In August, a circular economy seminar. In August, also careers night for Newcastle Uni. Networking drinks planned for October. They should be okay to go ahead. And for perspectives in water management seminar back in November. This is just a bit of a program and a sweetener for Oswater 20 online. A really big push by AWA to still bring relevant content to the membership and in a different way. So I'm really excited and looking forward to how this plays out. Next slide.
That's it.
No more slides. So one of the things that I forgot to do up at the beginning was a welcome to country. So I'd like to, before we go, apologise for that, but also to acknowledge the traditional owners on all the lands that we were present at today. I believe we've got people from right around the country that have dialed in for this very important seminar. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging across all those. And for the local peoples of the Darug Nation where I currently are in the Blue Mountains, again, my special respects for the custodianship of the land on which I live and which I work. So thank you everyone for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it and keep an eye out for our future seminars. This is a great way for us to share knowledge and to understand what's really happening in the engineering, science, politics across that, and proudly brought to you by the Water Association, Australian Water Association of us, for a very modest sum of money. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great week.
Thanks, Paul.